Right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. How many of you are visiting for the first time tonight? Oh, wow, a bunch of you. Well, you're very welcome. The Center for Fiction is the only literary nonprofit organization in the United States that solely focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we do this through public events like this one. We have reading groups, writing workshops, a kids read program, a first novel prize, an emerging writers fellowship. We're a library. These are library books that you see here. So please follow us on social and sign up for our mailing list so that you don't miss anything happening here, which is always a lot and it's always awesome. Not just what I do, but my colleagues too. To support our work, please consider becoming a member and enjoy all the perks that come with membership. And I want to say a big welcome to those of you who are joining tonight via the live stream as well. After the talk, we'll have an audience Q&A. If you're here, raise your hand and one of our fabulous interns will bring a microphone to you. Please use that so that the guests on the live stream can hear you. And for those of you on YouTube, please add your questions to the chat at any time, and we'll read those before we break for the signing line. Maura was kind enough to pre-sign her books, and we'll do a personalization line after the event. Tonight's event is part of our On America series, which brings writers, journalists, activists, and change makers together to reflect on critical issues of our times. Who are we and who are we becoming? How do the stories we tell shape who we are as a nation? Will we rise to the challenges we face? Last year in this space, we hosted a screening of the documentary The Big Payback, which is by Whitney Dow and the fabulous Erica Alexander, which showed the long journey that policymakers on national and local levels are trudging through to address the enduring harms of enslavement and systemic racism through reparations. So you got to see lots of city council meetings in that documentary. Maura Cheek's novel, Acts of Forgiveness, uses the tools of fiction to bring the possibilities and complexities of reparations to light through the lens of one family. In this way, the concepts of forgiveness and reparations become a story that lives in the mind and heart of the reader, showing what could be and inviting the reader to imagine their own versions of the story too. This is essential work for change and progress, and Maura does it beautifully. Please welcome Maura, along with the singular literary citizen, author, editor, organizer, and activist, Jennifer Baker, to our stage.
That table makes me nervous when it moves. Hi, everybody! And I want to say congratulations to Maura on her debut novel.
Thank you.
You can clap. I was going to hold it up, but I take the cover off so as to preserve the beauty of it. But I feel like it's post-Valentine's Day, so what better thing to talk about than reparations? Yeah. So I'm going to just kind of give an overview, which isn't doing this amazing novel justice. And then Maura's going to read, and then we are going to chat. And then we welcome your questions, especially for those live streaming. And then hopefully you've bought a book, and then you'll get a book signed. Hydrate. I'm an Aquarius. It is still Aquarius season. Yeah, so that's all the good stuff. Cool. So acts of forgiveness, and feel free to chime in if I'm not, again, doing this justice. There's the Revel family, but we're following mostly Willie, her sibling, her child, her parents, her grandparents. And there's this thing by President Johnson called the Forgiveness Act, which is meant to provide a level of reparations to, make up for enslaving Black people. And it's about $175K to each Black family that can prove it. And so the story isn't just about the Forgiveness Act, but it goes so much deeper. And I think Acts of Forgiveness really encompasses such a great thematic element that recurs through when we're seeing what Willie's life is like and some of the choices she's made and feels like she can't make, and the secrets and the regret that people have as well. So is that okay? Is that
You did a
kind
great
of okay?
job.
Sweet. I used to write copy.
You
So
killed it.
yeah. So what are you going to bless us with?
So I'm going to read from chapter 1, and there is a prologue, and I heard people don't read the prologue, so please read the prologue. But I'm going to read from chapter 1.
Great.
The diner was full of people who wanted to be around others the day the Forgiveness Act passed the House. The proximity to precedent felt good. There was no danger, no history yet per se, no need to stop routine completely, so it was enough to sit in the old diner at the blue speckled tables with scrambled eggs and large steaming mugs of coffee. Enough to ask the person next to you to pass the ketchup and also whether they thought this would go anywhere. Not in my day was often the answer. Enough monotony rubbed off of a dreary fall day for neighbors to linger and comment that forgiveness would never pass the Senate, as the anchor announced the House's intention to vote on it in the evening. The country, the city, the diner, connected by the same wavering thread of expectation. As Willie hurried in, she took up her usual stool beneath the television and tried to look optimistic, but she had imagined when a moment like this one came, she would be sharing the news, not watching it. Writing about representatives wrangling last-minute votes, what families needed to do to prepare for its passage, not sitting as she was now, 34 years old in the same town where she was raised. Most days she successfully calmed the disquiet, but today she couldn't help it and picked silently at her life choices like they were scabs. Vice president at her father's construction company, mother to a precocious daughter from a one-night stand, loving parents whom she still lives with. The second half of those ellipses ruined the mirage. For a long time, she was buoyed by the belief that change was around the corner, and now that it was here, she realized she should have been more specific in her faith. The Forgiveness Act, for many reasons, threw this into sharp relief. A waitress arched her back against the counter and pointed the remote at the television, inching the president's voice up several decibels. Everyone in the diner talked over one another, and it was possible to hear both the din of the restaurant as one throbbing sound and the individual pieces of conversation. The men next to Willie threw their voices at the screen as though President Johnson stood ready to take their orders from behind the bar. $50 she's on here tomorrow saying the House delayed the vote. It doesn't work like that. How do you know how it works? At least she's not using war as an excuse. The man to Willie's right, whose bald head glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, jabbed his knife at the screen. She's all right. I'd let her forgive me. What are you even talking about? I'm talking about her priorities and how they're on straight. They keep killing us, and while everyone else wants to pause and look abroad, she's trying to start fixing what's broken. Willie squirmed in her chair, sighing, and they turned to look in her direction. Well, what do you think? I think Johnson's all right. She took a sip of coffee and continued staring at the television, unable to tell them that she'd expected to feel a sense of release or excitement that hadn't yet arrived. The men shook their heads and exchanged glances that managed to lament the state of all young people of Willie's generation. Suffice it to say that it is not whether we as a country should make amends, President Johnson continued. It is that despite the fact nothing can ever atone for the injustices, we should still try. With approximately 40 million Black Americans in the United States today, the amount owed to each African American with an enslaved ancestor is $175,000 per person. This amount will help us begin to close the racial wealth gap in our country. An angry grunt escaped from the gray-haired man to Willie's left. Doris, can you turn this down? Not all of us want to listen to this forgiveness shit. The mood shifted as the men at the other end of the counter looked at one another, now lamenting certain white people of their own generation. A young mother who had been watching the screen expectantly turned back to her toddler. Doris ignored him and looked at Willie. When is your mother coming in? I need to talk to her. For a moment, Willie stared at Doris, whose eyes reflected the concern of someone who still saw her only as a child. I'm not sure, she replied, shifting again on her stool. Tell her I want to talk to her. See, there's this. Willie, clipping a $10 bill on top of her check, cut Doris off by saying she had to get to work. Waving goodbye, she stepped out into the thick September air to begin her short walk to the office. The sky was devoid of clouds, stamped instead with the faded color of worn-out leaves. The familiarity of her surroundings made her a stranger to herself. Rather than forgiveness allowing her to put a name to her anxiety, as national events tended to do, it instead confused her senses. Years ago, she had been told that the point of a family business was to be in control of your own destiny. For Willie, it had meant the opposite. The business that her father created out of dust and broken promises slowly rose to suffocate her, even as it gave her life, gave her family certain freedoms.
Thank you. I honestly could have. Can you hear me? Okay, it sounds a little bit weird. I honestly wanted you to keep going. So, go ahead. Joking, not joking. So I want to touch on wealth. And you say you had this wonderful Atlantic article, and it seems like that also helped birth this book in some way.
For sure.
And so do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because for a lot of us, books come from various ideas. They literally come in the shower, they can come walking down the street. But this article is a very detailed, talks about laws and the ways that wealth was allowed for certain demographics and purposely inhibited for others. And then to try and fictionalize that too, and like not being super messagey or overly didactic. So how is that for you in terms of having this thought process of what you want to talk about, which is bigger than reparations and wealth, and bring it in a story in novel form?
Yeah, you made the trajectory seem a lot cleaner than it was, but
I can imagine that struggle.
I wrote the article in 2019, and then I interviewed a professor, Professor Darity, who wrote a book called From Here to Equality, and he's really done a lot of work to study reparations and how it could actually work if it were to be passed. And so I interviewed him a lot for the Atlantic piece. And so in talking with him, I kept thinking about what would it actually be like for one family? And so I think I got to a point when I was at the time thinking of writing a nonfiction book, sort of more about the experiences of being a Black woman. I kept having these questions that seemed easier to answer through fiction, because I think obviously in fiction you can go places that you can't in nonfiction. And so, that's how the idea sort of started to percolate. It was just thinking about what if we were at a point where we weren't still debating that reparations could happen, and instead started to think about what happens if it already passed, and what would that experience be like for one family.
Yeah, and what I love about this book is that we are very centered and controlled, but we understand the kind of the peripheral nature of how this affects people too. Because it's not just about will this or will not happen, right? Like, is the Forgiveness Act going to happen or not? It's, okay, so what does that mean? Like, what does forgiveness mean? And I was literally talking to students, high school students on Monday, asking them, well, what does justice mean? And what does accountability mean? And da-da-da-da. And for some, it's like you're regurgitating what you've learned, which is like things are very binary, right? But when it comes to forgiveness, which we have both written about, which is kind of funny because we're both writing about these very realistic worlds with just this singular twist that look at forgiveness, it is so multi-layered. And as you were writing, did you kind of formulate in your head, I want to explore the expansiveness of forgiveness, and we see it through these characters? Or did you kind of want to look at a societal lens of forgiveness in tandem?
I think in the latter one, because I was thinking about, I called it the Forgiveness Act because I was thinking about how when you forgive, so much work is on the person who's been harmed.
Exactly.
Right? So it's sort of ironic, right? Because it's like the Forgiveness Act passed, but families have to do the work to actually prove that they're worthy of forgiveness, which felt super real.
Absurd. That they were like, so we didn't think this out, and you're like, on brand, America.
Yeah. But right, and I think that would be part of what happens, right? Which is that there are good intentions, but. And I talked with Professor Darity a lot about this a lot, because I think the reality is that it would be really messy, and so you need some sort of proof requirements, unless you're talking at the local level, which is a bit different. But at the federal level, I think you would need some sort of proof requirements, and so that's where I started thinking about forgiveness, because a lot of people think about reparations as like, well, we apologized, like we're good, let's move on. And so the work is still on the people, in this case, Black people who have been harmed, to sort of get to that point of forgiving or providing proof that they're worthy of the Forgiveness Act.
Yeah, and there's also this emotional toll that comes with proving something,
right?
Especially proving the atrocity of what happened that can still be up for debate to people.
Yeah.
And you spend time with that, because I do want to talk about the family, because the family, I'm a very character driven person, and so as long as I care about the people, I'm like, you're good, plot fine, whatever, but like, people's great, and this book has all that. But there's this, I'm doing my genealogy too, so, and you spoke a little bit about that too in the author's note. And I did it mainly because my uncle was murdered a few months before I was born, and I wanted to look into what happened and not solve it, but understand more. Yeah. And then in the unraveling of finding that out, you do this, all these other things come into play too. And so I want to ask about that, because it takes a toll on the character. And as the writer, I don't want to say you are your characters, but we are very present in what we are putting on the page, whether the characters are taking over or not. And so in the exploration of what toll this is taking on Willie, how was that for you to write about?
Yeah, I mean, so I wrote one draft where I didn't really go as deep into the genealogy, and then I threw it out because I was like, well, you have to sort of there's a lot that goes into genealogy, as I'm sure you know. It's like a very intense process if you're
especially you have to go back and like you're showing what Willie goes through, because just for context, like a lot of us are dealing with like the migration, right? Like, so you have to go back to places you may have never been.
Yeah, and I was struggling with, I was talking to my grandmother, and we can't really go much further than, okay, we know we're from Kentucky, but like, what does that mean? And
it's a big state.
Right. And, but sort of like I was wrestling with this, this desire to go further and wanting to know, well, where did we come from before the South? And so my family, we can't really trace that far back. And so that's a lot of where Willie's journey comes from, which is my inability, to go a little bit further back.
So can we talk a little bit about Willie? Because she's steering the ship in a lot of ways. So Willie, who we heard from in that first chapter, is someone I also relate a lot to. And another aspect, I'm just going to keep saying this, another thing I love about acts of forgiveness is that, you know when you watch like indie films like IFC, and sometimes I won't say I won't project. Like I would feel like, well, let me back up. There was this Golden Globe joke where like Issa Rae and the guy who played Shang-Chi, they were on and they said, wow, we can't wait to have more white people roles, like playing the alcoholic who like stops being an alcoholic and then teaches like children, inner city children, or like a former alcoholic who has a bad divorce, you know what I mean? And they started naming all these kind of like banal roles. And I was thinking more about like this role that Willie is playing. And I just wanted to see more of these kind of stories where we look at levels of privilege, but also levels of responsibility and also levels of guilt that are kind of put on her. Because there's that chapter where everything changes for Willie. Yeah. And I was like, I would love to see even more Black stories that kind of look at that one decision that just changes everything. And it doesn't like tear someone into an apocalyptic state, but it is this really nuanced, emotional space. So can you talk a little bit about how Willie came to be? And why does she steer the ship? Why are we following her?
Going back to your earlier point, I feel like writers struggle with this, where it's sort of like frowned upon, I think, to come up with a concept first instead of the characters sometimes. But for me, it was, I knew I wanted to write about reparations, and to do that well and to have people actually think about it in a certain way, I wanted them to fall in love with a character. And so a lot of Willie is me, but my mom would argue that it's probably more her.
Can you both be right?
We're both right. So I sort of came to her as a mix of like myself and my mom, but also knowing that I wanted to have a woman character driving the story. Chelsea, my editor, saw many drafts where there were many more women driving the story. But
how many?
They're using three different perspectives. Yeah. But I think, I mean, it was just important to me to have a family at the center of it. I feel like so many conversations about reparations is about like statistics and politics and numbers, and I wanted to shift that and make it more about the humans and a family actually going through it.
Right. And they have like the business, they have the house, and there's this real, very strong want to have something to pass on, to kind of have safety nets. And so also there's the understanding of privilege too, of what she has and what she doesn't have. But then there's just that overwhelming sense of like responsibility, which I think so many people can, and as a Black woman, I very much relate to that, you know, and how I was judgy of her parents. I didn't appreciate that. You know what I mean? Like when basically something happens and she has to take over the business, but they were like, no. And then it's like, no, you need to take over the business now. And I was a little salty after that chapter. I was like, no, girl, no. Nope. Because it's just, I don't know, it's so relatable, but it's just that shift. And it was done so beautifully where you see the love, and then I just was scared for her. Not as your life is over, but kind of your life is over. You know what I mean?
We write about forgiveness in almost opposite way. Like I'm writing about it from the perspective of like what the women have to forgive so the family can keep going. And you sort of write about it from the perspective of someone who's asking to be forgiven, which is interesting. Yeah. So I was looking at it sort of, just I guess how the women in this book, there's three main women in the book who have to forgive various things for their family in order for the family to like keep persisting.
And the hard decisions that get made that are kind of made for you. And could you talk a little bit about the other characters like Lourdes, Max? Marcus is the one who you must read about in the prologue. Paloma, Seb too, right? Yeah. Could you talk about like that family dynamic? Because they are, again, the love is there. And that's what I just so appreciate about this book. This isn't like, well, I'm still mad at you for something from 1997. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, we are moving on, but we still kind of hold on to certain things that we haven't yet.
Well, I think there's an alternate version where she doesn't do that, right? And so
a multiverse version.
Where she says, nope, I'm not coming home. And so that would be a very different book. And I think part of what drives the book in its current form is that they all have different opinions, but they're all sort of like working together towards a common goal. How they get to that goal, they each like view differently, but they all sort of have this idea that the wealth that they've built up to this point needs to be preserved, or it all sort of goes away. There's no point to it.
And there's a lot unsaid too, which I also related to. Like, this isn't my family, but it could be. Take away the wealth, but but the fact that Willie's parents, won't talk about things. Can you kind of get into that? I feel like I'm asking you to do like a character breakdown, because I'm just like, tell me their problems.
Well, I mean, part of it is, I think, if you've ever like asked an older family member about their history, they never give you like a straight answer.
Never.
And so a lot of like Willie's journey of going to Mississippi is like she has these pieces of information and she's trying to sort of like put the puzzle together, which is sort of reflective of my own experience, like trying to pull teeth from my grandfather. Like when I ask my grandfather questions about the past, he goes on like some random interesting tidbit, but that has nothing to do with what I'm trying to get at. So yeah, I think that sort of comes to life in Willie's journey in Mississippi and her talking to Marcus, her grandfather, in terms of like wanting to understand more of her history. He like doesn't really want to go there because the past is painful for him to remember. And so like, how do they navigate that of like having these painful memories, but like also her practically needing to get the information in order to have them qualify for the money.
And a little plot twist is that she knows president
Yeah.
to an extent,
Yeah.
right? This woman, President Johnson, the first woman president, who creates this act, and that she could have kind of been part of that legacy in some way. So that was part of the change. So how did that kind of relationship come into play? Like, can you talk a little bit about building the story? Because I'm just so intrigued about how all these parts came together of not just the big picture, which you pretty much talked about, but like building the family and building like that there's this entry point for her to kind of have a connection, but now she's so distanced from it by the time this decision is made.
Well, I was thinking about like what would have to be true for the United States to actually pass reparations. And so I think one piece of that is having someone who feels like deep personal guilt, as the president in this book does. She feels like a personal connection to it because she's an ancestor of Andrew Johnson. So there's some aspect of like, for it to actually work on a federal level, there needs to be people in power who feel responsible for moving it forward. So that's where she came into play. And then I think her connection to Willie, it sort of was used to emphasize really like these two paths that Willie could have been on, which is she was very close to actually succeeding in what she wanted to do. And so like deciding whether to pursue her dream or come home and accept the responsibility of helping her family.
And there was another one too, because it was like that Johnson lady wasn't necessarily the dream for Willie. Journalism was the dream for Willie. And then the other way that goes off too. And there's that beautiful mother-daughter relationship, but we also hear from Paloma as well. So you cut down on characters, but we still hear from Paloma. You're looking at Chelsea. Choices were made, weren't they?
Yeah, we still hear from Paloma because you sort of get the perspective of the younger generation, right? And of like what it means for her to sort of witness her mom going through this process and what it means for her to have access to some of their history that maybe Willie didn't.
And also how they both have to, like, we see the effects of racism, but not in kind of this overzealous way. It doesn't take over the book, but it is always present because, you know, and I find that, like, again, very expertly done in that it is not a book weighed down by it, but especially when something like the Forgiveness Act is coming, you have to factor these things in. So would you mind talking a little bit about that process of like drafting and no? Like, I don't know if that was a nervous laugh or what. There
were many drafts. There were many drafts. You mean talk about?
Yeah, like, so you draft it. I mean, we can talk a little bit about the publishing side, which I always ask if writers want to talk about because sometimes they don't want to, which I respect. But like, once you sell a book, right, and then there can be many revisions. There can be maybe not so many revisions. So when you find that person who really connects with that book, what does that kind of relationship look like as you make it into what we have in our hands?
Yeah. I mean, Chelsea like totally got what I wanted to do with the book from the beginning. And so I think, as writers, you're always like thinking about the book and how you want to change it. So there were many times when I would be like, well, what if we just add this part? And what about this part? So I think there's a portion of the book where we get a lot of like Willie's childhood, which I added because it was important for me to sort of set that stage of like, how did they get this house? And really like, what is at stake if they lose it? And so that sort of comes from those earlier portions.
And so can you talk a little bit about like what stayed, what went? I'm usually intrigued by that because sometimes for me it's like a lot goes away because I overstep.
No, I mean,
Or
A lot stayed. A lot stayed. A lot. The things that went away are still in the book, just in sort of like a different form. So there used to be chapters like from Lourdes's perspective that are now sort of like woven in between in Paloma's perspective. Yeah.
so why was that choice made?
Chelsea.
Spotlight on. I ask it mainly because it's like, again, like this could be kind of like a crafty element of like, is it, if it's like too much, let's not get into it. But like,
I mean, I think it's such like a sweeping, there's a lot I'm trying to do with this book. And so I think when you are like the more perspectives you introduce, the harder it is. To sort of like keep the reader following the thread. And so I think it's a lot better with the pared down perspectives. Yeah. And so thank you, Chelsea, for reading me in. Because I think it's easy from a writer's perspective you have all these characters in your mind and it's very easy to go there. And a lot of times I think it's harder for a reader sometimes to keep the thread of you like constantly switching perspectives.
Yeah. I mean, I love both, like a Tommy Orange or, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. And so the book is here, and in terms of like these characters and this larger discussion, I know it's your pub week, so I feel like it's kind of hard when it's like the pub week and you're like, well, people haven't read it as much yet. I don't know how fast people read, but if you read that fast, awesome. But also, I don't want to reveal anything at the same time, so it's kind of weird to be like, how have people been reacting? Yeah, so it's been 72 hours, and I guess it's been great. Or
I mean, it has been great. So I had the New York Times op-ed come out too about federal, and I thought I would get a lot of hate mail, and really not that much. So. True. A few.
I mean, we could just.
I stay away from Twitter, but or whatever it's called. But
it's Twitter.
Yeah. But so yeah, I mean, I honestly, when I first started writing the book, it was 2019, right? So
that was a very different world.
It was very different, and in the course of writing it, obviously everything changed, and I mean. If this was published in 2019, I think it would be a very different reaction to reparations. And now suddenly it's actually not as far-fetched. And you have many cities who are actually implementing task forces and actually implementing different initiatives, whereas in 2019 that really wasn't the case. So yeah, I mean, I think it is encouraging how much has changed. And so the reception of the book, I think, is based on a lot of that.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this book also sets up, again, like you very realistically lay out what this looks like for these folks and how there are misfires and how there's like a determination, but also how it doesn't fix anything.
Right.
Because it doesn't consider the entirety of what this issue is. Because when I was also... I'm like reading this book totally engrossed. I'm like, so what about education? Like, are we going to teach about this in a different way? Like, what about CRT, banning this, banning that, and then say you gave people reparations?
Right.
You're admitting to something that's been banned from being talked about in school spaces. So, yeah, I went there.
You went there.
Yeah, because I was like, we could implement this.
Yeah. Well, we could, right? But, yeah.
I mean, how would you see it? Like, is that a fair question? Feel free to tell me if it's not a fair question of, like, in terms of we could implement this, like, what would you want to see in terms of what a true reparations might look like?
I mean, it's hard because I think on the local level, I think like what Evanston is doing, I think is amazing, which is, for people who don't know, they give housing grants to people who can prove they were a resident during a certain time period or the descendant of a resident who was a victim of redlining. And so then they give them $25,000 housing grants, I think it's $25,000, which is paid for with revenue from the cannabis tax. So it's like, there is
cannabis
money.
tax. All right.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a creative way to do it, and it actually is a very tangible thing, right? That you're showing that you were a victim of redlining, and here's money for a grant. I think on the federal level, I'm not a policy expert, so don't quote
MFA.
me. But there's different ways, where you could apply for money to show that you're using it to buy a house or to start a business. I think the criticism is like, you can't just give everyone a flat fee, which is actually what I suggest in the book. And so, there's many different ways it could work. And it's not, I think it could also be tiered, right? Where if you have a certain amount of wealth, maybe you're eligible for less money.
I feel like we thought about this. Yeah, I feel like we need to do, like, this is the book we need to get into the hands of policymakers. Because it kind of provides that blueprint. But again, you have that emotional core that you can connect with people and see why this would be so impactful for them. And so I also want to ask, you're writing a book, and I don't feel like it's a heavy book, but it's very like thoughtful too. So how was that for you to write? Like, how do you approach writing? Like, how do you get in and get out? Is it a get in and get out?
Well, I wrote a lot of it during the pandemic, so there was no getting out. But
that's real. That's real.
But I don't know. It was an intense process just because of the time that we were living in.
Right.
Quite honestly. So I don't know.
That is also a very fair answer. Like it's all a blur. It's done now. I'm waiting for my check.
Mostly in the morning I wrote. So I wrote from like 5 to like 7, and then I would.
Wait, I'm sorry, 5 to 7 in the morning.
Mostly,
Wow.
yeah. So, but then I would like revise throughout the day.
Oh wow! So you're a morning person. Okay. I respect it. I don't do it. I respect it. I'm like, I stay up until 2 in the morning. So while you're getting ready to get out, I'm like now knocking out for all the.
That's
Yeah, it's a life. It's a choice.
It's a choice.
It's a life choice. Yeah. And so I also want to ask about, like, we've talked a little bit about Paloma, but that mother-daughter relationship, like, I love these generational discussions, but it's also interesting because, like, Marcus and Max, there's a lot there that also isn't there. You know what I mean when I say that? Like, y'all probably don't know what I mean, but we know what I mean, and that's what's important. And so when, like, Marcus and Max that's the father and son. So the grandfather's Marcus, Max is the son, Willie and Seb are Max's kids. There's this dynamic where it seems like the women are just trying to connect in a way that the men aren't.
They don't want to go there.
They don't want to. Like, why?
This is like therapy. I don't know. I mean,
I'm kind of like that. If you're my friend, you're probably like, Jen, this was very refreshing.
No, I mean, a lot of the book is driven by like the choices that the women have to make and the things that they have to do for the family. And so
because of the choices of the men?
In some ways, yeah. In a lot of ways. And I think the men are sort of, they want to preserve what has been built, but they don't necessarily want to like make those harder choices. The women in the book sort of have to make those choices for them.
Or live with the choices that have been made to an extent. Yeah.
So I mean, it's sort of the women in the book sort of mirror like the work of the Forgiveness Act, like the work of doing, the work of forgiving that in some ways like the country is asking of the families overall.
And then it is a woman president who brings this to pass too. And then again, they have to deal with the decision making. It's like a very matrilineal line that you're connecting in a lot of ways. And I don't know if you kind of but it feels like you purposely saw that, because I feel that a lot of that way in terms of my family too. It's like the matrilineal line was were the caretakers, and not just in a way of just like making sure you're fed or making sure things are clean. Like it was financial, it was like mental, psychological, it was spiritual too. And it was the result of like choices that men made that didn't take into account the grand scheme of things, where it's felt like the women did that.
Yeah.
In a way, and it felt very much clear in the book that that was happening, and I was just like more curious about it. But also because of those layers of like a decision at a federal level, and then looking at segregation, looking at wealth, looking at business owning, looking at racism and how that affects business owners, and all those kind of layers that you're juggling, and we're looking at it over generations. That makes a very textured book that is, to me, it feels like there's just so much to talk about in a span of, we have like 5 more minutes to talk about. But I just really love that aspect, because like when it comes to forgiveness and then like socioeconomic status, the ways in which people are just constantly pushing these things on other people.
Yeah.
So the family's feeling it externally and internally and personally, in a lot of ways too. And I don't know if that's kind of the layered nature you wanted the book to be read, or,
partly.
or you were hoping.
You
know.
went deep though. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was exploring like all those different themes, right? And sort of the interplay between what they're being asked to do from a financial perspective from the country, because I mean, another aspect of the book is they need the money at this point, right? So it's not I mean,
would you say no to 175? Would anyone here say no to 175K right now?
But I think there's a world where like, what would it be like if they didn't actually need it? Because Max and some, I mean, it's hard to talk about the book without like giving away.
I know, right? But,
yeah. So I don't know. There's a world where how would they act if they didn't actually need the money? Maybe it would be the same, but I think the choices that maybe Max and even Willie to some extent make might be a little bit different if it wasn't like necessary.
And whether or not it's a reality too, because there's that fear. And I remember my grandmother, she had said before, I mean, she was alive. I was very glad that she was still alive when he got elected. But she was like, that's never happening. She's like, that is never happening. And it happened.
Yeah.
And there was this lack of emotion for her. And it was just interesting, like in reflection of this, like, okay, so are you happy? Are you cool with this? But I don't know if it's just like, I'm not even going to let myself hope.
Think about it.
That also kind of appears in the book too.
Yeah.
They're like, this is not happening. And then it's like, we're watching that play.
I asked my grandfather a lot about like, what do you think about reparations? And he's like, and like turns up the volume on the TV. It's not a real consideration. And I think part of it, right, is like, why go there? Because it's so in some ways like unrealistic. Especially like given everything that he's grown up with. It's like that's not really on the radar.
And if it might bring up something else for him too, of like, I just don't even want to go there, because then it's like the cap is off and da-da-da-da-da. So how are you feeling this week?
It's been a lot, but it's beautiful. I mean, the reaction has been amazing, and it's great to see people actually like getting the book and reacting to it, and it's been emotional.
Yeah. Well, I want to congratulate you again, because obviously I'm a fan.
Thank you.
Of this book, and I hope everyone has a copy and is going to read it, and then has deep conversations with Maura about it.
Thank you.
I meant that. And so we're going to go to questions from the audience or the live stream. I can ask more. We can sit here for a bit, because I'll be like, and so Paloma's teacher, what's her problem? But there is someone who has a microphone. Yes? Yay! You seem very cheery. Yay!
Here.
So does anyone have questions? Are you open to craft questions? Are you open to like, questions about your op-ed?
Right room.
Hello. So thank you for this wonderful conversation. I have 2 questions, if I may. So one is just, how has your family responded to the book? And then the second is more, don't know if it's a question really, but you said this thing about your grandfather just turning up the TV, right? And the question of reparations comes up. And I just wonder if the book takes up the sort of question of, the harm is done, and time moves on, and a forgiveness is offered or sought, I guess, or both. I'm not sure. And I wonder if the book takes up the idea of like not just you guys alluded to nothing changes earlier, but more that something along the lines of even if the you're asked for forgiveness, there still is this thing that's time has moved on. Like the thing has happened, and the wound is there, the scar is there. Time has moved on, and so in a sense, no matter what happens in the future, the past is still the past.
Mhm.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a question in the book that we didn't really touch on, but the president asks it before she becomes president, which is, can forgiveness be political? And can it be lasting? So that's sort of like an animating question in the book, which I think is sort of what you're touching on. And yeah, I didn't want to write a book where like reparations passes and everything's great. And so I think the ending of the book sort of will answer your question. It's sort of a cop out, but not really, which is like the complications still exist, and the complications still exist for the family, and especially for Max and the things that they've lived through, which I think would be true for any of us, right? That if reparations passed. And in terms of how my family has reacted, I think it's always hard for writers when like there's not that many writers in the family. Like they're like, my grandfather's always like, so when are you going back to work?
Grandfather's cold-blooded.
But they're happy and they're excited, and yeah.
They've read it?
My mom has read it. Yeah,
Okay.
my mom has read it, and she loves it. So
Okay.
yeah.
Did she leave a review?
She doesn't know how to teach.
We're going to teach her. Does anyone else have any questions? We have one way up front.
Thank you so much. One comment and one question. So the comment was the point around people having to do the work themselves to kind of prove, even though they're the ones that should be getting, am I getting this the right way around? You know what I'm trying to say though, basically. Mm-hmm. The same was the case in the UK with the Windrush scandal. Mm-hmm. People having to prove their ancestors were part of that scandal, and then access to justice is so far behind where it should be. So just wanted to make that comment. On the question side, with the research you've done and with your conversations with the professor, beyond the kind of economic reparations, what are the key other areas with regards to reparations, to your question earlier on the kind of education piece or access to other things? What are the kind of key bits there that you think make up the best package of reparations, essentially, beyond the economic piece? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think housing is really important just because of the impact of redlining, right? And I think some component of education would be important. But then I do think just money is important too, and like giving the choice to the people to figure out how they want to use the money instead of saying like, here are different buckets for you to use it. But obviously I think housing and education are two of the most important.
Anyone else? And you also mentioned taxes in your Atlantic article. So I highly, highly recommend folks can read that. It's an amazing piece.
Thank you.
Did I see a hand raise? Yes, over here.
Thank you. You might have already touched on this, or it's in the book. There, in the discussion for reparations, I've had people do this pushback saying, well, for example, Rosewood, when there was legislation in Florida because of the white mob attacks on the black people of Rosewood, that when they got the money through legislation, it caused rifts in the family, and they spent the money frivolously. And I actually talked with one person who said it was a mistake because they didn't know what to do with it. And I responded with, you have rich white people blowing their inheritance all the time. And no one is saying that they shouldn't have gotten the money in the first place, any outside, and so therefore there should be no inheritance. I don't know because I have the book, but I haven't read it yet. Do you go into these people who are the naysayers that, black people are too irresponsible to get this money and use it wisely?
I do.
We have to.
Yeah, there's definitely a strain of criticism that is like the common criticism, right? Which is like, well, wealthy black people shouldn't get it, and why? Like, should everyone get it? I've already gotten an angry email of like, well, wasn't that angry, but Oprah's a billionaire, should she get reparations? So yeah, like there's a strain of it in the book, which is criticism that happens like right after the act passes.
So someone took the time to send you an email.
It was a long. It was a long email.
It was a long one, yeah. Of course it was. Any other questions? Those are like the politest people ever.
It's very nice.
Oh, yay! Someone in the back.
Hey, yeah, you said craft questions are okay, right? Yeah. So I'm just curious. So from what you've described, it sounds like you wrote like entire different drafts of this while locked in during the pandemic. I mean, what I'm curious is like when you're stuck with kind of by yourself with the work for that long, and you have to start over from scratch from when you decide one approach isn't working. How do you like distance yourself from what you tried the previous time and kind of start over again? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't recommend the approach. I don't know. I mean, there's pieces of it that I kept. So I like kept a document of like, I guess, strains of the narrative that I wanted to preserve. And then, so I think it's impossible to fully distance yourself from the other drafts. I don't even think you should necessarily, but yeah, I think if you can preserve like the core narrative pieces and different pieces of the characters, then that's how you sort of go forward.
May I ask if there's kind of a question or conversation that you would like, not that you demand or want people, but you might like people to take after shutting this beautiful book?
Good question. I mean, I would love more advocacy from individuals for reparations on the federal level. I feel like people are always like, yeah, it should pass, but then they never actually vote for people who believe in it. And the first step is a House bill that has been brought to the floor every year for the past like 2 decades, and it's never passed. It's never reached the Senate in terms of just a commission to study the effects of slavery. It's like pretty basic. And so I guess what I would hope is that people read the book and then actually study the reality of reparations a little bit more and vote for people who believe in it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. More than fair. Because it also feels like it would not totally unravel, but it would lead to so many other discussions of like occupation and all these other ways in which, not just America, but globally, colonization has been basically the worst. I'm not going to curse. Basically the worst. Yeah, I feel like that's a stepping stone too to understand how it affects Indigenous folks and so many other communities who are Indigenous to spaces. Yeah. So we do have time for one more question. I don't know if there's anything from the live stream. Not so much.
We can take one more question from our audience here if you guys have one.
If you don't, that's oh yeah, we have someone on this side.
Is there something you wanted to do in the book that for whatever reason you really couldn't do it?
No.
That's a flex if I ever heard one. Congratulations on this amazing book, and I feel like this is a book that will help us with narrative change too, because it will make us think differently. So thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming. This is amazing. I know you're all desperate to get your hands on the book, which is great. If you already have one, you can come on up here and get in line to get it personalized. If you haven't picked it up yet, it's over at the bookstore, so you can go out the back doors. And then we'll be just on the other side of this wall getting the books personalized. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. We'll see you soon.